So, this lecture is about the new imperialism. This is a change from what we saw during the Age of Exploration. In the 19th century, what we're talking about in imperialism is where you're controlling another people through their political, economic, cultural systems, and then you're using it to benefit your political gain and economic gain. This scramble for new colonies is driven by many things. One, it's driven by the industrial revolution and the desire for more raw materials to make the goods and products. Also, as part of the industrial revolution, it's driven by the needs for markets to sell those goods and products once you've produced them. The other thing that's driving this imperialism is nationalism. Now, once we created the empire, our states, empires such as Germany, Italy, things like that, then it becomes a scramble for nations and nationalism to gain power, to look prestigious, to be part of the game, so to speak. You also, as we know from U.S. history, Mahan naval power is that to maintain that power and status and protect yourself in your trade routes, you needed colonies to maintain military power around the world. Also, you're going to have a push back by states who want to get free of imperialism. And all this tension, both economically, politically, and socially, is going to lead to increased tensions and be that final straw that pushes us over into World War One. So the biggest question that you're going to see, especially on the AP exam, is this difference between the old world and new world. Not old world, new world, but old imperialism and new imperialism. The old way of doing it, this idea of colonies. One is that there's the way you ran the colony, that these were literally excerpts from your state. That this was basically when you were in America, you were in England. And in the case of like America, that was part of what triggered the American Revolution, was that shifting of where we had been treated like this and now we're not. Also, in many cases, these weren't markets to buy goods as much, and that this was more of a raw material. We needed certain cash crops such as tobacco, cotton, molasses, sugar, coffee, and it was basically taking these raw materials and shipping them back to the new world, and not as much as a market system. Also, where these are going to be shifted, that these colonies in the first part were almost all in Latin America, Caribbean, and there was limited contact with Asia and Africa. And the shift is going to happen because of technology. That with quinine, you can now go into Africa and not suffer from sleeping sickness. You're also going to have the Maxim machine gun, which is going to put you at a higher capability than native populations that also had the similar weapons during the 16th century and 15th century. You also are going to have steam power where you didn't need as many horses. So technologically, Westerners who could not go up against Africa because of similar capabilities or ecological reasons or geographical reasons, now because of steam, quinine, and Maxim machine guns, you can easily go into these areas. On top of it, in Asia, China had still been very dominant and had capability of pushing off Western advancements until the 18th and 19th century. So places like India and China, which had before been strong enough to resist political, economic, and social influences by Europe, now are finding themselves susceptible due to internal issues and drug abuse and other and technological advances in the West. One of the biggest changes, though, between what happened in the 19th century and what happened earlier in the 16th and 15th century is that the way we treated native populations in the early part of colonization and exploration, you had the Inca, where native populations were treated as almost the noble savage, that we're here to turn you into one of our people. Because one of the driving forces during this time, during the earlier time period, was religion. And so you were trying to convert these populations over to Christianity, and therefore you didn't see some of the treatment you're going to see in other areas. Now, obviously, you're going to have slavery during this time, during the time period we're talking about in early history. You're not going to see slavery as much in the 19th century for a simple fact that, one, because of the French Revolution and changing liberal ideas in Europe, that there was not a political desire for slavery because it had been outlawed in 1830s in England and then obviously in the 1790s in France. However, there is economic slavery in the fact that you basically are keeping these populations down. That noble savage idea is gone. We're here because of social Darwin. We are better than you. We can capably to control you and use you for what we want. We're also not going to make them citizens in the modern concept of imperialism. In the earlier version, and what we saw in Latin America in the 15, 14, and 1600s, there was this idea of adapting these populations into Spain, into French control. That's not the case here. Indian populations are not going to be citizens of England. They are subjects of the crown, but they are not citizens of the crown. So social Darwinism, control, seeing them as subjects, less as individuals to bring into the culture because of religion in the Income India in the 14, 15, 1600s is vastly different than what you're seeing in the 19th century because they're not citizens and they're those savages that need to be dealt with or taken care of in the 19th century. Plus, you don't want slavery in the 19th century because slaves then can't purchase goods. And remember, this is a market economy that not only are we stripping Africa of needed natural resources, we're also then trying to pump European goods into places like Africa and Asia and India. So, oh, you're also going to see a vast migration. Part of the thing with the Industrial Revolution is there's this massive growth of population. And so you're going to see this shifting of 60 million people to balance out the population increases in Europe. Now, obviously, World War I and World War II are drastically going to reduce populations, but during this time period, this is the shift where you're going to see Italians, Germans, Russians, Irish, all of these populations moving around the world, and not all of them are coming to America. Some are ending up in South Africa, some of them are ending up in Asia, many are ending up in India, a large population in Australia. So the biggest thing here is the increase between the haves and have-nots as far as, and this is where the strife is going to come. This is how this leads into World War One, is that colonial powers such as England, who had a head start because of their economic and political stability and the Industrial Revolution that gave them a leg up on everyone, they have gone around and conquered vast amounts of territories and they have the crown jewels. They have India, they have China, they have South Africa. They're going to end up with control over Egypt. And so these crown jewels thing now make powers that are just showing up to the table, like Britain and well, sorry, not Britain, Germany and Italy, jealous, and Japan, which is going to feed a lot of this rivalry that's going to feed into World War One. So the tensions over natural resources and this competition concept that's being formed between newer states and older states is what's kind of be driving into World War One. One of the best examples of this kind of motivations thing going in is what happened in the Belgian Congo. Livingston, who is actually humanitarian, was working with the African populations. He was unknowingly a scout for the Belgian government. And when he goes missing, Stanley goes down to try to find him. Well, Stanley actually is a spy. Yes, his mission is to find Livingston, but it's also to open up control over the Congo. And because one of the particular things they need out of the Belgian Congo is rubber. And that's going to lead to what's going to happen in the Belgian Congo. We're talking about that. Another motivation besides, and Livingston's idea is humanitarian and religious. There is a religious connotation to this of going in and saving these people. There also is this ideology of nationalism and social Darwinism. One of the readings you have is of Kipling's White Man's Burden. We'll talk about that one in class. But this idea that these are uncivilized savages that must be taken care of and that we are superior. there also is a use of in the nationalism. So obviously, white man's burden is social Darwinistic idea that we are better and superior than these other people. Now, the Germans and Russians, though, will use it to distract. Like colonial holdings are a way of distracting from what we have screwed up. Like, if, oh, look, there's problems back at home, but we're going to go over here and deal with this. So, um, in Egypt, we're going to see the ideas of these new imperialistic ideas in Egypt, where what happened in this case was where two Western powers actually going to manipulate the collapse of the Egyptian government. Is that in an attempt to try to modernize his country, he had taken out the Muhammad Ali had taken out huge amounts of debt, and then the process of that debt made it so that his country was susceptible to a bank collapse, which then to protect the assets, Egypt moves in, and he'd taken out this money to help build what the Suez Canal. Well, in doing this, the debt he ends up putting himself susceptible for takeover, and they basically the British take over Egypt with red tape. They literally create a banking coup, which collapses the Egyptian economy, which then puts Egypt in economic crisis, which then the English come in to save, and by saving it, take over the place and end up building the Suez Canal and controlling it. Um, in Congo, like we said, this was an example of the scramble for Africa where all these countries are competing. King Leopold II had basically taken the Belgian Congo off the books. Like his own government didn't know what he was doing in the Congo. And what he was doing was torturing people. They were going in and whipping people with hippo hides. They were cutting off the arms and legs of children in a way of forcing their parents to work. Like, I'll go and kill, torture, and maim this guy's family so the other families will go work. And they're doing this because there was millions to be made off of the ivory and rubber trade, which was needed for everything from pool balls to piano keys in Victorian Europe. But also the rubber was needed to make the belts that drove the Industrial Revolution. And all of this was being done completely off the books. Like, no one knew this was happening. And then what happened was that photography and pictures that were taken by missionaries in the Congo were released, and that led to the Free Congo movement. And then that um, alerted the Belgian government what was happening, and this savagery that was being taking place against the African populations in the Congo caused them to seize control of the Congo government and the colony and push the king out, which then led to some reforms and a halting of the atrocities, but the damage is already done. Um, to keep this thing from happening, Bismarck and the president of France are going to get together and hold in Berlin a conference. Now, Ferry's doing this because he wants to ensure French holdings. Bismarck's doing this because he knows if there's a war, he's smart enough to know that if a war is going to happen, it's going to be triggered by imperialism. He wants to basically protect not only German holdings in Africa and other parts, like they have some in Southeast Asia, but it's also to prevent a war. So they literally take the map of Africa and it works like Risk. Wherever you have troops, that's where you can basically draw your lines. Like, you just draw your lines and that's where you can do it. Okay. And the reason why he does this is to prevent a war from happening. That if everyone knows clearly whose states are whose, then there's not going to be a conflict because they're not going to fight over these things. See how that works? So by 1880, Europeans are control about 10% of Africa. The only state that's free is basically Liberia, which is over here on the coast. There's Liberia, is right here. Here's Liberia, and here's Ethiopia. Technically, though, Ethiopia is the only state. So, and this is why Bismarck draws these lines, is that if this is French and this is English, then everyone knows where the lines are and it's less likely to cause a conflict. Like, here's Germany, right? This is German held territory. This is German held territory. Everyone knows where German held territory is, and therefore there will not be a conflict. And like I said, Liberia is owned by America. So, so that was the reasoning. So the British in Africa, we're going to see there's a push to gain more territory. And this is where we're going to see problems. This is what Bismarck was talking about. The Battle of Omdurman. You're going to see the defeat of the Sudanese. And then, but because of this conflict in Sudanese, there's the Fashad incident, which basically the French and Britain nearly go to war over Sudan because it looks like the British are moving into a French territory, but then the French, what stops them from actually going to war is the fact their own government is near collapse because of what happened with the Dreyfus affair we talked about before. So this is what Bismarck's talking about, is that if you can get these little conflicts could actually spur up into a real conflict. You're going to see the Boer Wars in South Africa. The Boers were the indigenous population. Well, they're not the indigenous. African populations are the indigenous. The Boers are the colonial Dutch that had moved into that area back last semester in the 1600s. And they saw themselves as the indigenous population. And because South Africa was wealthy in gold and diamonds, there was a lot of money to be made in South Africa, and they felt the Boers thought it was their right. So, in other words, when they were freed from the Dutch, the Boers thought that, hey, we're going to be okay. We're going to be under English control. And then a war broke out between the English and the Swahili, right? Or sorry, the not the Swahili. Broke out between them and the I'll think of it. Give me a second. We'll come back to it. But a war broke out between the Africa Zulu. There it is, Zulu and Shaka Zulu. The British had defeated the Zulu. And it's very much like what we saw in the Americas, is that the defeat of the indigenous population, the African population, then the Boers, the settlers, thought that they would get rights to control however they wanted. Well, that wasn't going to happen. The South Africa was too rich, and so that led to a conflict with the Dutch population that was there and the English. Out of this, also, you're going to see Cecil Rhodes, who basically he carves out his own country named Rhodesia out of this. So, and so this is the Boer Wars. And again, we're going to see this example of where imperialism is going to trigger a conflict. And this is what they call the Kruger telegram. That Kaiser Wilhelm II, that nosy busybody who wants to make himself more powerful, thinks that if he can basically stir up a civil war in the Cape Colony in South Africa, that the Boers could throw out the British, and then he could make them loyal to the Germans. And that would give the Germans then control over the Cape Colony. Well, the problem is this looks like Kaiser Wilhelm is meddling in British affairs. And remember, the advantage to all of this was you want to keep England isolated. Don't piss off the English. Let them be distracted by colonies. That was the whole purpose of Bismarck and that Berlin conference. Well, it's backfiring now because the Kaiser is actually provoking the English. By backing the Boers, it looks like you're meddling in English affairs, and the British and Germans are now getting heated. And this is going to feed the tensions going into World War I. British forces basically defeated the Boers. And so they basically combine these areas into the Union of South Africa, the Transvaal, Orange Free State, Cape Colony, all of them form into what is South Africa. For the native population, the bad part of this is that once you unified all these areas, the Boers implement with the begrudging backing of the British government apartheid system, which lasted all into the 1990s, which basically left the indigenous African population as third-class citizens in their own state. They had to have papers to move. They can only work in so many jobs. They're economically, politically, and socially downtrodden because of this. It's like segregation in America on steroids. So the French, they're going to take over Tunisia, Algeria, France, West Africa. They're going to include Morocco, Sahara, Sudan, basically that whole big northern chunk of Madagascar. The Algerian, though, will be a problem later. We'll talk about that. For the Germans, they're going to take over areas like the Cameroon, Togo, Southwest Africa, East Africa. Most of their conquests are not violent, but there is an incident that happens, and they kill like 50,000 men and women. Yeah. Italy. Italy's constantly after Libya. They're gonna but they're defeated by in Ethiopia. So they're going to take over Libya, but they're not going to be able to take over Ethiopia because Ethiopia has a modern military and is backed by Western powers. But it's not going to stop them from doing it again in the 1930s. Imperialism in Asia is a little bit different here. One, you're going to see what we call the Opium Wars, that England is going to subjugate China without subjugating China. Now, in India, they're just going to take over the place. In China, they're going to manipulate control over China. How they're going to do this is the sale of opium. That England needs tea, but they have no silver, and the Chinese want silver. But in India, where they're producing cotton, which is why they don't need American cotton during the Civil War, they have vast amounts of opium from what they use to replenish the soil, which is poppies. So then, using backdoor approach, they sell massive amounts of opium in China. Now, granted, they are going to sell opium in large amounts back home, and so technically Queen Victoria is a massive drug dealer. But by selling the opium in China, they will addict almost 60% of the male population of China, including the emperor and most of the royal court, to opium. And then when China tries to stand up to the British then send in a fleet, triggering what we call the Opium War. And the problem is that China, like we said before, had been very advanced. Well, now it's not as advanced anymore. British guns, British ships are way much better than what the Chinese have, and their fleet is wiped out pretty summarily by the British. That led to the Treaty of Nanking, which forced China to cede Hong Kong up till 1997. So basically, Hong Kong was British territory. It was part of England, and they could use that then as a port of trade. And so the British could trade anything they wanted to in England, or sorry, in China, without any duties, any tariffs. They had no control over it, and that's why Hong Kong still has political strife with China today, is that it has a long history of being under British control and being a free state, and now it's part of China. For China during this time period, this is that creation of spheres of influence. Chinese bureaucrats had to kowtow, literally bring their head to the ground in front of British you know Western control power. And so this is going to trigger another second opium war, which again is soundly defeated. And this opens up more British and French trading posts. So China is basically subjugated economically and politically by this point, and they're working on social. And then to weaken it further, in 1850, there's a thing called the Taiping Rebellion that Chinese native Chinese had been indoctrinated with Western religious ideas, and then supplied with weapons. They led a rebellion. This Hong Xing here, Shai Qin, there we go, led a rebellion against the state, backed by British weapons, in this attempt to try to spread Christian and Western ideas. While the rebellion got out of control and the Manchurian government couldn't hold it back, and it turns into a massacre and millions die in this civil war. And then the British then use this again as an excuse to take control, because the British then pour in military troops at the request of the Manchu government to bring this under control, and then by doing so makes the emperor compliant to the British. So they basically start a rebellion by supplying the weapons and the indoctrination, and then when it went out of control, they used it then to take control of the British government during the Taiping Rebellion. At the same time, you have a new power, just like the United States has already beaten the snot out of Spain in the Spanish American War. You're going to have the Japanese now, and the Japanese are going to win the war, and it's a very long war, the Sino Japanese War. Um, and now Japan is becoming an imperial power. U.S. is going to push for what we call open door policy. They want their cut as well as other countries. And this is what's going to lead to the tensions between the United States and Japan later. That America sees this idea of free trade. Now, I'm doing the air fingers, free trade as a way that they can trade their goods into Asia. Well, but that along with other European powers. They wanted their cut of the pie. Well, the problem is this is where you're going to see not only is going to lead to animosity socially, politically, and economically in China, which is going to lead to the communist revolution in China, but it's also going to lead to economic, social, and political strife with Japan, which is going to lead to World War II. The British in India, you're going to see the British East Indies Company had already been hard at work in the 1750s and 1760s in establishing control over India. This was under Robert Clive. Clive was a brilliant strategist economically and politically in India. How he did it was he influenced the Rajas. You know what you have to understand is that India had never really, except for a short period in time, under Asoka, been a unified state. Now the country had broken apart after during the Mughals had broken up into basically areas that were controlled by what they call rajas. And then what he was doing was by supplying them with weapons and British trained troops and titles and the occasional bribe, he was slowly weighting these Rajas over to his power, in other words, influence of the British. And then after the 7 Years' War and the defeat of the French and that whole business that happened in the Black Hole of Calcutta, the British were the ones who were the dominant power now in India. The big change happens in 1850, in the 1850s, in 1857, 1858, that a group called the Sepoys, who were British trained Indian forces, one who were already upset with this idea of British control. Add to the fact that the British had been supplying them with cartridge rounds. And remember, in the 1800s, these are paper sacks filled with gunpowder, wadding, and a bullet. Well, to keep them dry, they had to coat them in something that soldiers could easily chew through and load. Well, what they were covering them in was animal fat. Now, England has pigs, but pigs don't produce as much fat as a cow. Now, if you put that all together, you can kind of figure out what's going on. Between nationalism of the Sepoys and a fear that the British were taking over their nation, couple it with the fact that their cartridges are covered in animal fat, which is cow fat, which is making so that every time they load their weapon, they are violating their caste system and their Hindu beliefs. That caused a rebellion. The British then used the rebellion as an excuse. Now, remember, they trained these troops. They use this as an excuse then to go to the Rajas and say, oh, look, you can't control your people. They're going to come after you. We need to protect you. How about if we send in British troops? And by doing so, they were allowed to take over India. They basically, again, just like you saw in the Taiping Rebellion, they triggered the rebellion and then capitalized on it. Only the British. And then that in 1858 allowed for British parliamentary growth and basically taking over India. Now, the modern, you are going to see, it is a benefit to India that you're going to see the integration of railroads into India and some industrialization. You're going to see secondary and college education being implemented. And so the idea of education did help both Indian populations and help the British because this was a way that that those petite bourgeois could move up. You're never going to be a member of parliament, right? Not until the 20th century. The guy down the street, even still today, think about it. The person that just growing up in a modern high school somewhere, not every one of them gets to go to Congress, right? They have to, there's that bit where they make some money or they get the right connections. But this was a way that that common everyday guy who was really good in college in Oxford then could move up. I can't be a member of parliament, but I can go be a bureaucrat in India. I can't hobnob with the elites back in London, but I can hobnob with the elites in India. And so this was a way for the British middle class to move up socially, politically. In India, the education system allowed for bright and intelligent members of Indian society to get advancement. The only problem is there's literally a ceiling that that even though they're educated and you know see themselves as a part of their society, they're not allowed to go any further. That the government is still run by the British. That it's the British that are running this, not you. And so your state, even though you think you're a hierarchy, you're not. That the British are the ones doing this, and that led to the formation of the Indian National Congress, which are these educated Indians. One, obviously, Mahatma Gandhi, were pushing for um, equality and self-government of India. Notice that many of them are Hindu. They're predominantly Hindu, and that's what's going to lead to the assassination of Mohandas Gandhi. Is that Gandhi is looking at an integrated state of both, and you have to remember, India is a population that is at the time during this was going on was there was a large population, a Muslim population, and a large Hindu population, and also some Buddhist. Um, that's what's going to lead to the formation of Pakistan, and that's India is going to finally get its independence in 1946 as all this comes apart. And this is the Indian National Congress. Other colonies, while the British control Burma, Malaya, North Borneo. This is why the Japanese are going to do their version of island hopping as they move down the coast closer to Australia. They also have control of Australia. Now, Australia, by the way, is a perfect example of a mirrored concept of history. That if you look at the history of the Western idea, now granted, it was one of these dump states. This is where we're going to see on one coast is the actual colony. On the other coast, they were just dumping out people that they're emptying the prisons, which is what the British would do from time to time. Some were violent criminals, most of were political criminals, but many of them are just the poor. That these people are indigent, they don't have any money, and we're booting them out to make room. Okay. And so it that's a little bit different. But once you get past that and you look at the range history of America with the treatment of indigenous populations in Australia, looks very much like what we saw in America. That as the European white population moved into the interior, they became more and more repressive towards the Aborigine population, much like what you saw with the Native American population, till eventually you have range wars, you have liquidation of populations, and you have the removal of native populations um, to reservations, even the forced westernization of populations. In America, you had the Dawes Act, which was it tried to turn native populations into Western European ideas with farming and education. In Australia, they literally took Aborigine children away from Aborigine families and put them with um, Australian European families to indoctrinate and make them Australians. European Australians. So, and that was the whole reason back in the Olympics in the 90s that took place in Australia, why they had an Aborigine woman light the torch. It was part of this whole we're sorry kind of thing. So for the French, I don't think we need to go too much in depth what's going to happen here. Indochina with modern day Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, Tahiti, New Caledonia. Now, the thing is, though, we're going to see the same thing that what people don't, the same thing concept we're going to see in Africa is the same thing we're seeing in Vietnam. Is one of the ways that the French were manipulating these populations was kind of like what the British were doing in India, that they would set a group in the society above the rest. So they would take the most intellectual, most politically connected, the most easily swayed to French ideas and culture, and they would give them the most power, the most education, the best jobs, and it created a society above the society. So they could rule through the Vietnamese. So you have French governors, French military, but the real running of the state is through the Vietnamese governors and this ruling class. They literally create a ruling class in Vietnam. So when we go in, you're not really fighting a war against communism per se in the 1950s and 60s. You're fighting the Haitian Revolution. Remember, that was that Peninsulari and the Creoles, that social divide concept. That's what the Vietnam War more or less was. I mean, add into it the social political ideas of communism and the spreading American influence in the 1950s and 60s, but it's also this cultural idea that we didn't understand, that the French had set one part of society separate from the others and created this animosity that was feeding the Vietnamese War. They're going to do the same thing in Africa, and that you're going to see in the Hutus and the Tutsis, which is going to lead to what happened in Rwanda between the French and the Belgians. They're going to set one group above the other, and then that's going to lead to social strife and eventually genocide of almost 3 million people in Rwanda. The Germans control the Marshall Islands and Samoa. Oh, wait, no, they don't, because those are part of ours now. America takes those as our rewards for World War One. So, yeah, the Germans had them during this time, and now they're part of American holdings. America, like we talked about the Spanish American War. And the reason you're able to kick the crap out of the Spanish is because at this point, Spain's weak, and they really the part you want to take over, no one cares about. Like you used the Spanish American War as a manipulation to take over Hawaii so you can get Pearl Harbor, so you can have your power anywhere. And then the Philippines, that's part of your I need bases everywhere thing, and Guam, obviously. And then Cuba, you kind of do this weird, we don't really own you, but we're going to control you kind of thing that's going to set the stage for what's coming in the 1950s and communism. But the reason the Europeans let you take out the Spanish is because they don't have anything anybody else wants, and they don't care that you take them out. And for America, you because you don't threaten their holdings in doing it, unlike what's happening in Africa and Asia. So, and then China, we're going to see some uprisings. One of the best examples of an uprising would be the Boxer Rebellion that's going to take place. Um, in the 1900s, which you are going to help put down in America. In Japan, you're going to see the opening up. This is one of those things America does. So you have two new players, right? You have America is taking out Spain, which doesn't really cause that big of a thing, but Japan is a strange thing that takes place. Is that before this, the Tokugawa shogunate, because of guns that were brought in by the Dutch, right? That's what this was. That when Matthew Perry comes in and opens up Japan in 1853, it had just become unified because of the implementation of firearms that came under the Dutch in the 1600s. So those warring states, the warlords, the shoguns, had finally been tamped down into one state. And in 1890, you're going to see what they call the Meiji Constitution is formed. And this government creates this almost Bismarck authoritarian. Remember, we talked about how it looks like on the outside, it looks like a democracy, but it's not really a democracy, that it still had this authoritarian control in there. Um, Economically, you're going to see this night and day that companies like Mitsubishi are established by former samurais who's literally go and cut off their top knots. Okay. You see the Zabutsu, which are these business families that are formed, these like Mitsubishi and all these that are going to lead to massive amounts of economic growth in Japan and a rapid industrialization. You're going to see the introduction of Western clothing and Western ideas. So there's very much this boom that takes place economically. Um, Definitely, like I said, introduction of Western clothing, Western universities. You're going to see some adaptation for women, but not much. All right. But you are going to see where the military starts wearing, the kimonos are gone. The samurai swords go from the backs to their hips, and they wear them like swords. They're like a normal Western sword. You see a rapid industrialization of its military. You see the introduction of Western music, Western culture, all these things. Baseball was popular. Okay. And then Japan, like the United States, has to basically express itself. It has to become an imperial player. And so that Trans-Siberian Railroad makes them fear that, oh, wait, we've been fighting this war and we just took a good chunk of China. So now we're afraid that Russia is going to come in. And also, they want that port. They want the Sakhalin Islands and kind of a bridge to protect both Japan and to get their foothold on the continent. And so in 1904, they massively wipe out the Russians. It isn't even funny how easily they beat them. And the United States, the new player, negotiates the peace at Portsmouth, the Treaty of Portsmouth, ends the war and puts America and Franklin Roosevelt as a major player. Now, the problem with this is Japan now sees itself as a Western power. The problem is it's the only one that sees itself as a Western power. It's going to go into World War One thinking it's going to be treated as a player, and as it rapidly is industrializing, it has a population boom. There are more wars, so the population increases, and it's an archipelago. It only has limited space. It also, in its industrial revolution, needs new materials. It needs markets. You just got every European power just licked all of Asia, and what are they going to get? And then on top of it, when World War One comes, they get little or nothing for their efforts for fighting against the Germans. Add to this, so you're seeing the setting up of World War Two. Add to this that the Russians see themselves as insulted for losing to a non-Western inferior race. That's how they see it. And so, to compensate from this, they cannot back down from challenges in Europe. So, when there's the assassination of the Archduke of Ferdinand and Austria goes to declare war on Serbia, they can't back down. They have to save face. As far as the Muslim world, like we said, you had the Mongols. The Ottoman Empire is basically falling apart. The Mongols in India are going to lose power to the British, and the Sufids in Iran are eventually going to lose power to the British and French in World War One. And it's because they haven't seen much change. The imperialism basically gone around them. That the wealth and power wasn't in their they took where the trade was coming from. Like, how do you maintain a Muslim empire when England just took all your stuff? So, and the Ottoman Empire is going to try to reform, but it's just not going to work. They're going to introduce Western ideas, but the sheer amount of nationalism that's taking place in the Balkans is not going to allow this to happen. And then in 1908, you're going to have the Young Turks, a group of highly educated, westernized, liberalized Turkish leaders and intellects are going to overthrow the government, which, although it is stopped and eventually put down, this rebellion further weakened the Ottoman Empire, opening it up for when 1914 takes place and the eventual collapse of the Ottoman Empire during World War One. Iran, we're going to try to westernize, but obviously Britain is eventually going to dominate it. And then obviously that this is going to fit right into Karl Marx's ideas that he just sees imperialism as an extension. You're basically just the bourgeois reaching out to another place. And that those people are now the proletariats. So, and Hobson, we'll talk about him in class. Basically, that it's the businessmen and bankers that people are voting for going to do imperialism, even though they're not going to benefit from themselves. And then there's going to be an emerging anti-colonial ideas. You're going to see this with the Fabians, the anti in the Free Congo movement, and that basically you're spending huge amounts of money to maintain the empires. What's their benefit? And then we already talked about what's happening there. And this wraps it up. So, all right, that's all.